Good evening, y'all. So 2 weeks ago, we started our session on church history, and we just kind of covered that earliest, that 6 to 70, the 6 BC to 70 AD, the birth of the church. We're going to have a little bit of overlap with that, but tonight we're going to move beyond the age of the apostles, which effectively ended about 70. I mean, John lived past that, but 70 was the time of the destruction of the temple, and so the age of the apostles is really considered to be prior to that time. Peter and Paul were both martyred in the 60s, and so we're moving into that, into what is typically called the age of Catholic Christianity through 312. 312. Who knows what's significant about 312?
Christianity was legalized
by Constantine. So this moves into the age of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Now, when I say the age of Catholic Christianity, I'm not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. But the word Catholic means universal. So what I want to do is explain that, and we're going to start by looking at a map. Okay, so what this map shows, I don't know if you can see the legend down here. So this red line shows really the greatest extent of the Roman Empire, which peaked at about AD 117. And what you see with the green colors is that's the growth of Christianity during the first century, so prior to 100. And then you have the growth of Christianity in the second century, which is in that gray part. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit. The first century saw just this explosion of the church, and it expanded in all directions and continued through the second and third centuries. So the term Catholic was first used by a man named Ignatius, who was the bishop of, any ideas, Lance? Alexandria. Yes, in the early second century. And he said this, quote, "Wherever Jesus is, there is the Catholic Church." Now, when he used that term Catholic, which means universal, he was focusing on two things. For one thing, the church is global. It is not a local movement, okay? It goes from, Carthage. Can you see Carthage down here in northern Africa? This is where Tunisia is now. Do you see that right above the word Africa? So it's just north of the city of Tunis now, all the way over into, you're getting over here. This is where Iran starts. So you're getting into the Persian region, you're getting up into Europe, and the church is just exploding. This is not a local, and it's not only is it not local, it's not monolithic in its culture. It's hitting all kinds of cultures. And so the second thing, though, is that there's one body. One body. The scattered church was still one. And there's a unity to it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the spread. It began as a Jewish movement. As much as 7% of the Roman Empire was Jewish. So there were a lot of Jews. And there were a lot of Gentiles who worshiped God. Now, a lot of Gentiles didn't completely convert to Judaism because of the circumcision issue. And not only is that a hard issue for a grown man to deal with, but that is something that was seen as really disgusting to the Greeks and the Romans. It was repulsive. So most of the Gentiles who started worshiping God, the God of the Jews, were what we call God-fearers. And they were the most fertile mission field. These were people, think about why they would be the fertile mission field. They have already agreed there's only one God, very unpopular in the Greco-Roman culture. But now they can worship that God without having to be circumcised and without all these other requirements. And so it was very appealing to them. They already knew the Old Testament. And you remember when Paul's going around and the other missionaries, they're going around preaching the Old Testament to people, because the Old Testament is the scripture that talks about Jesus. And so you see all of these folks coming to the Lord. So the church started out as a mainly urban movement because the Roman Empire was primarily urban, and the urban centers all contained synagogues. And that's where the first missionaries went. You know, I think a lot of times we really lose sight today that Christianity was not a new religion. It is the fulfillment of this old religion. It is the fulfillment. It is the coming of the Jewish Messiah. See, the first converts were these Jews, and they're going around to other Jews to tell them, hey, the Messiah came. Where are you going to go? Well, you're going to go to the synagogue. So they went to the synagogues, you know, obviously until they started getting kicked out of all the synagogues. Antioch, I don't know if you can see Antioch, it's kind of hard to see. Right up here on the coast was a major Roman city, and they were the mission sending city. And when they sent the missionaries out, you look, Paul goes to all these cities. When you read about his missionary journeys in the book of Acts, he's going to all these cities. By the end of the 4th century, half of the city of Antioch was Christian. That is where the disciples were first called Christians, is in Antioch. So the church spreads west, is really just about as far as it can go. It spreads to northern Africa. And why didn't it penetrate further into northern Africa?
The Saharan.
That's the desert. There's nobody there. Yeah, so they are. They're going to these cities. It's going east, and there's even indication that it went as far east as India. And we don't have note that it really took root there this early, but there is indication that there was gospel witness as far as India. Ephesus is a significant city right here on the coast. This is the Aegean Sea, and so it's on the coast there. And Ephesus sort of became Paul's home base for a while. And it was the seaport. It's the gateway to Asia Minor from Rome. And they saw unusual growth. And in Asia Minor is where the church started becoming more rural. Now, it was still primarily an urban movement, but there was a governor of Bithynia. I don't know if you see Bithynia on there, but that's part of Asia Minor. There was a governor of Bithynia named Pliny, and in the year 112, he wrote to Emperor Trajan because he was troubled by the spread of Christianity. And he said of the Christians that there are many in every period of life, on every level of society, of both sexes, in towns and villages and scattered throughout the countryside. And this was a problem. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about why this was a problem. You see Rome over there in Italy. By the year 250, there were over 30,000 Christians in Rome, and they were mostly poor. Well, how do we know that they were mostly poor in Rome? Because all of the writings there are in Greek, and the rich people spoke Latin. And so it was the slaves and the poor people. Once the church took root there, the center of the church did move over to Rome. So there was growth to the west and even growth to the north. There's a man named Irenaeus who was the bishop in Lyon. That's in France. It's too high for me. It's in France, right up here on the Rhone River. And we know the gospel is going up and actually takes hold in France. There's a presence of the gospel in Spain. And the very first ecumenical council, you know, I spent a lot of time last year talking about the Nicene Creed and the Nicene Council of 325. The very first ecumenical council was actually in the city of Arles, which is in France. And it's right here at the mouth of the Rhone River. And that was in 314. And so what they did is the emperor called all the bishops together. There were 3 bishops from Britain. Nobody knows how they got there. I mean, there's really not an... How did the gospel get all the way up there to Britain by the 4th century? We don't know, but they sent 3 bishops to come to this council. And so, that's kind of a cool thing. By the way, that council, one of the things it did is it condemned a heresy called Donatism. And the big thing about the Donatists is that they said that the work of the priests was not effective unless the priests were completely pure. So like you get baptized by a priest and later find out he had sin in his life, your baptism's not valid. Anything the priest did is not valid. By the way, that is something that has carried over to the Catholic Church to this day. You might remember this priest out in Arizona years ago that saw a video of his baptism as an infant and realized the priest at that time used the wrong words. Therefore, he was never truly baptized. Therefore, every baptism and wedding he had done as a priest was invalid. Yeah. Africa, Carthage. I already mentioned Carthage there, which is Tunisia. That's where we see the first Latin-speaking churches. The man named Tertullian was the writer known as the father of Latin theology, and he is the first one to use the term Trinity. He's the first one actually to use that term. So there's this idea floating around out there. You see it in all these movies and books and documentaries that the Trinity was a concept invented at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Tertullian died in 220. 105 years before the Council of Nicaea, and he's using the term Trinity. And the Trinity, Trinitarian theology was really most codified at the council that took place 156 years later. That's where we first get the creed there. Cyrene. You see Cyrene on the northern coast of Africa, right below where it says Mediterranean Sea, kind of below the N in Mediterranean. That's Cyrene. That is in modern-day Libya. And there is a biblical character from Cyrene. Who is that? Simon. Who was he? He carried the cross of Jesus. Yeah. So it's been wondered, is he the one that carried the gospel to Africa? I don't know. We have an Ethiopian eunuch too. So here's a guy from Ethiopia that got the gospel. And that's the way the gospel works, isn't it? We also know that the Cyrenaics were present on the day of Pentecost, because when it's mentioned in all the countries that the Jews came for the day of Pentecost, Cyrene was mentioned. And in Acts chapter 11, there's something really interesting. In Antioch, some of the believers who were preaching the gospel in Antioch were from Cyrene. How did all that happen? I mean, it's just, the story of the church is just beautiful and fascinating. And then, of course, you have Alexandria. And, you guys know Lance and I just spent, 12 days. Well, 3 of those days were travel days. We really spent 9 or 10 days in Alexandria. That was the second largest city in the Roman Empire. There were a lot of Jews there. And the claim is that John Mark is actually the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark, is the one that first took the gospel there. In fact, Lance and I got to visit the church of John Mark, and it was really cool. And I think there's actually good reason to believe he is the one that traveled there and took the gospel there. So, I mean, you've got Syria. I mean, just in the first 150 years or so, you've got Syria, you've got all the way up to France, you've got Spain, you've got Northern Africa, and it's just going like a wildfire, and it's a great story. But why? Let's talk about some of the reasons for the rapid spread of the church. The first is what I would just say is passion and conviction. They were compelled. They were compelled to go and tell. There was a missionary fervor among the believers, and not just those who were called to go, but of the sending churches. You see the sending churches making great sacrifice to send missionaries out to the unreached parts of the world. Y'all, I just a couple hours ago got back from Dallas. I went to, I'm going to talk about this some on Sunday, but last night and today I was in meetings in Dallas with the with the CEO of our Southern Baptist Executive Committee, the president of the International Mission Board, and the president of the North American Mission Board. And it was really neat. And by the way, I want you to know the reason I was invited to this is because they invited the pastors of the 250 top giving churches to the cooperative program. And to talk about it and to have table discussions. And we were able to ask questions live of these guys and to talk about the future, the present and the future of the IMB, the NAM, the cooperative program. By the way, that top 250, that's about top 0.5%. I also learned, and I'll share this Sunday, that there are 47,000 Southern Baptist churches. 9,000 of them give 90% of the money. So about 18% give 90% of the money. There were 15 to 20,000 Southern Baptist churches that give zero to the cooperative program. And it was just so exciting to be in that room. There was a pastor in the room whose church last year gave over $1 million to the cooperative program and over $1 million to the Lottie Moon offering. And that's just cool. And that's one thing I love about Southern Baptist is we were birthed out of this desire to see the gospel taken. The cooperative program was birthed from this desire to see an effective means of sharing the gospel. And this is what you see in the early church is this passion to get the gospel to the ends of the earth and the believers coming together and sacrificing to make it happen. So you had the passion and conviction. You also had this resonance with the human condition that the gospel brought into this Greco-Roman world. So you know that in Athens, when Paul speaks at Mars Hill, we're told that the two main philosophy groups, and we know this from history, were the Stoics and the Epicureans. And they were night and day difference. The Stoics advocating suppressing all human desire. It was a life of discipline and asceticism. No pleasures, no conveniences, no comforts. And this was the way really you were supposed to experience life. The Epicureans were the opposite. The Epicureans said pleasure is where it's at. That is what humans do. We experience pleasure. We are to give in to our desires. And that's where we find satisfaction. Here's the problem. You had these two main philosophies and neither of them worked. Neither of them worked. Why didn't the denial of human desires work?
It's too hard to follow.
Well, human desires are given by God too, so.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
Not only that, you're denying your own humanity.
Right.
And by the way, you can like say, I'm not eating that pie, but you still want it.
Yeah, you still think.
Yeah. And so, this idea of denying yourself doesn't do anything to fix your condition. It doesn't get rid of your desires. It suppresses them. And so it doesn't lead to a better life. You got to learn how to get control of those. What was the problem with giving in to your desires?
Because you eat the whole pie.
You're supposed to, the lesson here, one piece is all you need. And it shouldn't be round. Yeah, but this is what the book of Ecclesiastes is about. You see the richest man who ever lived giving in to all of his desires. And he says, it's just meaningless. It's empty. So these things don't work. So the gospel comes along and says, sin is the problem, and here is the solution. Here's how you can have victory over it. Here's how you can have victory over your sin while also enjoying pleasures in life. So it gave a moral framework of discipline that also experienced the pleasures that the Lord has given us in a way that is actually good for the human condition. So the gospel really resonated with what people are looking for to be satisfied. Love in action. So Tertullian said that, this is from one of his writings, he said, the pagans often say this, quote, see how these Christians love one another? He said, that's what the pagans are saying. The Christians cared for the poor. I mean, in Acts, we see them taking collections for the famine, right? For people in the famine. They cared for widows and orphans. We see that theme all in Scripture. They visited prisoners. We see that in Scripture. They visited people who had like, because of their debts or their crimes, had been condemned to work in the mines. They went into the mines to take them food and water and the gospel. They were active in disaster relief. When there was like Vesuvius or any kind of earthquake or something, the Christians rushed in. I mean, disaster relief is not a modern thing. It was then for the Christians. There was an emperor in the 4th century named Julian. He wrote this. By the way, and I'm going to explain why, a little more why, but they called the Christians atheists because Christians denied all the Greek and Roman gods. Yeah. So he says this, atheism, meaning Christianity, has been specially advanced through this is a Roman emperor, has been specially advanced through the loving sacrifice rendered to strangers and through their care for the burial of the dead. It is a scandal. By the way, they also equated Christians with Jews, okay? It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar. In other words, there wasn't one Christian who was a beggar. And that the godless Galileans, these are the followers of Jesus, the Galilean. We're godless, right? Because we don't have all their gods. The godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well. While those who belong to us look in vain for the help we should render them. This emperor recognizes it's a scandal that the Christians not only care for their own, but they care for us pagans. Something we don't even do for our own. Persecution. Talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but the word martyr means witness. That's what the word martyr means. It's a witness. And throughout history, you see the church expanding during times of persecution. In fact, you see conversions at the moment Christians are being put to death. And then, not only is the church spreading, but it is changing the world. The social impact. So there was a 2nd century Greek philosopher named Celsus. And in about 177, he actually wrote the first formal systematic attack on Christianity. I mean, he wrote this attack. And he said this, quote, "Far from us, say the Christians, be any man possessed of any culture or wisdom or judgment. Their aim is to convince only worthless and contemptible people, idiots, slaves, poor women, and children. These are the only ones whom they manage to turn into believers." So his criticism is it's only the lowest people in the world that are interested in Christianity. Does that sound familiar? How often are we ridiculed in the media for being, just these rubes, these uneducated, gullible people? I was witnessing to an atheist here in town, and he used this word, well, scientists keep abandoning Christianity and turning away from God. He sent me a list, he emailed me a list of scientists who rejected Christianity. So I emailed him a list of a couple of thousand scientists who turned to Christianity. I mean, you can play, these are just games, right? But I mean, it's a false allegation. But Origen, who was from Alexandria, wrote a book called Contra Celsus. So he reads what Celsus wrote, and he writes a response to it. And one of the things he said is that Celsus is actually arguing for the validity of the gospel. Because where else can you find a message that includes the poor, the uneducated, the women, the children? Because our message is for everyone. I love that he owned it. Yeah, we are reaching the idiots. But they were also reaching the successful people.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, he's not doing anything for those people. We're lifting them up. The gospel was appealing to outcasts. But not only them, it was appealing to scholars. I mean, you have apologists, right? Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen, Anselm, and others, and they're formulating these apologetic arguments for Christianity, and they're defending the faith in the academic realm of the day. So the church is spreading, and there were problems. By the way, how many of you have been in church for a long time? You'd say, I've been in church for a long time. Have you ever seen a church that didn't have some kind of problems? There's always something. Always something. We always have problems here. There's always problems. I mean, that didn't mean they're catastrophic, but man, I'm putting out fires every day. You know, that's just, I tell people I preach for free. You pay me to deal with knuckleheads and put out fires.
That means you're being a good shepherd.
I don't know about that, but that's just the deal. And the thing is, like if a church is in decline, it's going to have problems. But if a church is growing, it's going to have problems. You got to pick the problems you want, right? And so, so there were problems, and I want to talk about the threats to the church. And there were two primary categories. The first is the external problem, and that's what persecution is the biggest there. Persecution in the early church was not always widespread. It was not always just like, it wasn't continual. It like popped up at different times and places. You had some emperors that came along and they tolerated the Christians, and some emperors that came along and they wanted to kill all the Christians. And, you know, a lot of it was very isolated in pockets. But it's important we ask why. Why the persecution? Why have people for 2,000 years wanted to persecute the Christians? And I actually didn't put these on the screen, but I'm going to give you 7 reasons. One is convenience. And inconvenience, I would even say political expedience. Rome burned 6 days and 6 nights. Nero probably did it. The general consensus is that Nero did it. But he blamed the Christians. And a lot of them were arrested. A lot of them were crucified. They took some of them and sewed them into the skins of wild animals and let wild dogs loose on them. They tied some women to bulls and had them dragged to death. Nero would hold parties, and he would wrap Christians. He would tie them to poles and wrap them in oil-soaked rags, and when the sun set, he would light them on fire to light his parties.
How do they come up with this evil?
People have been coming up with wicked things since the dawn of time.
Sewing somebody to an animal?
Yeah. Well, crucifixion, I mean, that's just...
Yeah, we know about that. I never heard of that.
You go read some of the stuff the Ninevites did. And I mean, it's terrible. Read some of the stuff the Nazis did. I mean, this has always been the case. Peter and Paul died at the hands of Nero. So sometimes it's good politics. You got a scapegoat, you got somebody to blame, you can deal with somebody's causing you a problem, get rid of them.
Still happening today.
Yes, it is. Second, they gave rights to slaves. Christians would actually buy slaves to give them their freedom.
That's good, right?
Yeah, but why was that a problem?
Because they didn't want them to, I'm sure.
How many of you saw, what was it? I think the movie was called Amazing Grace, wasn't it? About William Wilberforce, who wrote the song Amazing Grace, and he was a slave trader. And he and what's the other guy's name? His compatriot that they really worked to, you know who I'm talking about too, don't you, Steve? They worked to abolish slavery in England. No, that's who I said.
I'm sorry. I was sleeping.
Yeah.
That was.
And they, huh? I'm not sure. Anyway, it was very unpopular because if we don't have the slaves, who's going to do the work? If we don't have slaves, we're actually going to have to pay people. That's going to hurt our business. So man, you can't free the slaves. We need them for the economy. And this is just the way we do things. My goodness, we saw that in America. Who's going to work the plantations? Oh, I forgot I didn't list these. The Christians valued life. They wouldn't abandon their sick. People would take their female infants or their sick infants and go leave them in the woods. There were actually places where this was done where the early Christians would keep people on watch in those woods, and when somebody would go in and leave an infant, they'd go in and bring it out. And they'd raise it. They had Christian families who would adopt these children as their own and raise them. But what this did is this marked them as different. They had a moral high ground, and when you take the moral high ground, it brings conviction. When you start standing up for the disenfranchised, the people that don't stand up for them aren't going to like it. When you start calling out the evil of abandoning your baby in the woods, when you start calling out the evil of abortion, people do not want to hear that. And along with that, number 4, they were markedly different, especially morally. People hate what is different. Y'all, we Christians have a sexual ethic that is diametrically opposed to the world's sexual ethic. Why do they care? Why do they care what we believe? What? We're not hurt. They're saying leave us alone. I'm saying leave us alone. We're not doing anything to you. I've shared this story before about Russell Moore being interviewed and was asked, well, aren't you afraid, don't you think people are going to find you Christians strange because of your sexual ethic? And he responded, that's not even the strangest thing we believe.
Yeah.
We believe some strange things. I mean, the one he talked about is we believe Jesus is coming back someday in the clouds riding on a horse. Why doesn't that bother anybody? Because it doesn't call out who they are and what they want to do. You want to believe on the magic man from the sky? Go ahead. But don't tell me that my desires are wrong. So the Christians were different with their sexual ethic. I keep trying to click here. Number 5, they rejected the pagan gods. For one thing, that made them social misfits because they didn't do what other people did. They wouldn't participate in their pagan feasts. They wouldn't offer up prayers at meals that these pagans offered up. It was also an economic issue. They wouldn't buy the idols and the other things, the incense and the various things used in worship. So the more people that became Christians, the less there was for the economy for those kinds of things. They were accused of atheism. Like I told you, they denied all the other gods, but not only that, they didn't have any idols in their homes. They had an image, and they also didn't erect images of their God. Therefore, they didn't have any gods. And they also they were insulting, each city has its own patron god. And they didn't give homage to, and so people were afraid that was going to anger the god of their city. So they were blamed for anything that went wrong. Tertullian again said, quote, if the Tiber floods the city, or if the Nile refuses to rise, or if the sky withholds its rain, if there's an earthquake, a famine, a pestilence, at once the cry is raised, Christians to the lions. They were blamed for anything that went wrong. Number 6, slander. The Christians were slandered. They were accused of having orgies. Why? Why were Christians accused of orgies? Because they had agape feasts, love feasts.
Oh,
Yes.
that makes sense.
Yes. They greeted one another with a holy kiss. Everybody knew they weren't having orgies. But it was just a slander. I mean, we see the same kind of thing today. It's just a slanderous accusation. They were accused of being cannibals. Why?
Communion.
Communion at our love feast, somebody's getting eaten. And then 7th was the confession. The confession is Jesus is Lord, so they refused to say Caesar is Lord. Pliny, the governor of Asia Minor, in his letter to Trajan in 112, explained that if his rule in Asia Minor was that if a Christian is found, he's to be arrested on the spot. If he's a Roman citizen, he's delivered to Rome to be put on trial for treason. If he's not a Roman citizen, we just put him to death on the spot. In the 3rd century, Emperor Decius issued an edict that once a year, every Christian had to burn a pinch of incense and say, "Caesar is Lord." When they did that, they were given a certificate to prove their citizenship. If not, they were considered guilty of treason and labeled an enemy of the state. So all this to say, the Christians were persecuted because they were purely countercultural. Which leads us to ask, if we're not being persecuted, why? I don't think we want to go around looking for persecution, but I wonder if we were making more of an impact on society if we might see that more. Maybe we blend in too well. Then there was internal problem, and that's heresy. By the way, I'm going to go back. Hold on. I had another note here about the persecution and about the spread of the church. And Revelation deals with this. Revelation 12, verses 10 and 11. John says, "And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, 'Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of His Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God.' And listen to this. 'They have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives, even unto death.'" Satan is defeated by the blood of the Lamb and the testimony of the church. By Christians who don't love their lives, even unto death. And that's why you see conversions when Christians are persecuted. Because what the world sees is people who have found something more valuable than even their own lives. So heresy. The main threat to the church was the danger of being undermined by a different gospel. You know, today people don't care about the historical Jesus. I just like Jesus' teachings. Well, they probably never read his teachings. The early believers saw that as inconceivable. Who Jesus was. The gospel is actually about a historical series of events. The gospel is the good news, and it's not just the moral teachings of Jesus. It is the life, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus. Theology was very important to the early church, because without true theology, there is no true church. So they fought for orthodoxy. Even before the councils were in the 4th and 5th centuries, you see a lot in their writings about the rule of faith, and the rule of faith is the doctrine of the church. Heretics were confronted, churches were warned, and orthodoxy, the councils were always in response to a heresy. Orthodoxy is usually articulated as a response to some heresy. And the church confronted heresy with the Bible. Some of the earliest heresies, you have Paul in the Galatian heresy. When he writes to the Galatians and accuses them, he says, "You've accepted a different gospel, which is not a gospel at all." In other words, you've accepted a different gospel, which is not good news. And that was that they were requiring people to be circumcised and to keep the feasts and all these kinds of things. That's not the gospel. And he's confronting them about that. You see John in the Gospel of John making the argument that Jesus is indeed God. You see John in 1 John arguing that Jesus came in the flesh. In the 2nd century, the Ebionites held that Jesus was just a man who became the Messiah by keeping the law perfectly. But he wasn't God. He was just a man. The Docetics. The word docetic comes from the Greek word dokeo. Have you come across that one yet, Lance? Dokeo is to appear or to seem. And so the Docetics said he just seemed to be human. He was really a spectral appearance, but he never became human. The most aggressive was Gnosticism. In fact, Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, was going to a public bath in Ephesus, and he saw a man named Cerinthus who was a Gnostic, and Polycarp stormed out of the bath in a towel and said, "Let's flee before the baths fall in. Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is inside." And this is where a lot of the false gospels came from, these additional writings that came 200, 300, 400 years after the time of Christ. They believed in a supreme God and an idea of salvation and heavenly beings. But they saw Orthodox beliefs as materialistic because the material world was evil. There was this dualism that you had the material world and the spiritual world, and the material world is bad and the spiritual world is where the good is. They identified evil with matter. So the ultimate highest deity would have never created matter because it's bad. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. So Jesus can't be God because a true God would not take on flesh. He would not become a material entity. But instead, this supreme God created a bunch of lesser deities called aeons, A-E-O-N-S, these aeons, these lesser gods, and they are the ones that created matter. One of these aeons was the God of the Jews. He's the one that created the heavens and the earth, the material world. Another of their aeons was Jesus. In fact, the God of the Jews, according to the Gnostics, was powerful enough to create the universe, but he wasn't wise enough not to do so. They said Jesus rejected all matter and the law, that he was not human, and he passed on knowledge, and the way of salvation was attaining to the knowledge that Jesus passed on to people. Well, what is that knowledge? That's for you to figure out. You got to get in tune with Jesus, and he passes on that knowledge to you. And when you've attained that, you've attained salvation. By the way, there is a practical Gnosticism today. It's not called Gnosticism. But it's people who aren't concerned with theology. They're not concerned with the historical Jesus. They base their beliefs on, well, it's just what I believe, that's all. Well, why do you believe that? Well, I just do. I don't think that's what God would be like. Well, why don't you think that? I just don't think so. Well, where are they getting that information? It's just in their minds. This is what I like to believe. This is what I want to believe. Therefore, that's what must be true. People reject the gospel accounts because they say, well, Jesus would have never said that. What I wonder is if you don't read who the historical Jesus is, how do you know what he would or wouldn't have said? Well, I just know. That's my Jesus. My Jesus would never say that. Persecution, par for the course. It's going to happen. But persecution does not destroy the church. Our biggest threat is false teaching, heresy. The church never got mad and fought against persecution. You read the history, you read the Bible, you read the New Testament. How often did the Christians fight back against their persecutors? How did Jesus teach the Christians to deal with persecutors? Love them. Pray for them. Do good to them. But they always fought against heresy. They always pushed back against heresy. They always called it out publicly, purged it from the church. Without true doctrine, we have no true church. And that's one of our big lessons from tonight. The church spread, and the church spread because the Christians were preaching the word, they were preaching the gospel, and they were telling people about Jesus. The problems only came when the false teaching infiltrated the church. Questions, comments? You have 1 minute.
Mike, you're talking about persecution. I heard David Nasser being interviewed today, and he was talking about the fastest growing church
Yeah.
in Iran.
Yep.
Amazing.
Church is exploding in Iran. We actually have people in North Korea. We don't have any Americans in North Korea. We don't have anybody on our payroll in North Korea. But we have people in North Korea that we are resourcing and communicating with, and the church is growing in North Korea. And when they get caught, they get killed. They get thrown into labor camps and get tortured until they die. And the church is growing. It's growing in Iran. In fact, let me look at these numbers. One of the things I heard today from the president of the International Mission Board. By the way, there are sometimes security concerns where they just yank our people out of a place. They go get them. But currently, they're letting the missionaries make this decision. Currently, we have 100 adults and 80 children sheltering in place in the Middle East. And they said, we'll pull you out as soon as you say so. And they've said, we can't go now. The gospel's spreading faster than ever since the war broke out. People are looking for hope. People are terrified. And they're seizing on those opportunities. And all across the Middle East, people are accepting the Lord in a time of war. And our missionaries are saying, our missionaries there with their children are saying, don't make us leave. Y'all, that's who's out there doing this stuff. That's why we have to fund them. We have to fund them. If we don't, who will? I'm going to give you all another preview to something I'm going to say Sunday. We compare what we do with fully funding our missionaries to what's called faith-funded missionaries. Those are the people that have to raise their own support and make contacts, and they don't have an organization paying for everything. We pay for health care. We pay for the education of their children. We pay for their retirement. By the way, right now, the retirement for the IMB is so funded that every IMB personnel who is qualified for retirement, there's enough money to get them through the rest of their natural lives. Absolutely. I mean, Lance and I just spent time with some of our missionaries. They were kicked out of a country they spent 11 years in, isn't that right? They spent, yeah, they were kicked out by the government. So they just pivoted and went to another country. They got 6 kids, or 7. They got a house full. And they're just, Lance and I are communicating with them all the time now. And they're telling us about all this gospel-y stuff that they're doing. And anyway, of the faith-funded missionaries, most faith-funded organizations, a term is 3 years. 50% of them don't complete their first term. A full term for career missionaries with the IMB is 4 years. Only 5% don't complete it. And it's never for financial reasons. It's because there's a death, there's a health problem, there's a family crisis, something like that. The average tenure of faith-funded missionaries globally, 5 years. The average tenure of a Southern Baptist missionary, 14 years. Think of the stress we take off of them because they don't have to worry about where their next meal's coming from. When we fund our missionaries, we pay their salary, their health care. By the way, the IMB is self-insured. You know, there's not like United Healthcare isn't going to insure people all over the globe, right? I heard the president of the IMB today say, if we have somebody that has something catastrophic happen to them, we got to evacuate them from the country, and their care and their evacuation costs $1 million. We write a check for $1 million. No questions asked. He said there's not another mission organization on the planet that can do that. We take care of their house. Their salary is not very much, but their housing's paid for, their transportation's paid for, their retirement's paid for. The schools their kids go to is paid for. If they homeschool, their homeschool materials are paid for. And there's a security overwatch. They have a phone. And if they wander into a dangerous territory accidentally, their phone rings. And somebody says, hey, we show you just left your area. Are you okay? Yeah, it was an accident. Okay, turn right at the next intersection. We're going to get you out of there. We heard a story today. I know it's late, but we heard a story today about there's this room, people in it 24/7, Christmas Day, everything, monitoring. And there's a map that shows there's a dot for every cell phone. He says they don't monitor, they can't find these people, they only get it if something goes on. There's news, there's social media everywhere. There was a shooting happening, a live shooting event happening on a university campus in Spain. An alert popped up because one of our missionaries was across the street from that university at a coffee shop. They called her. Said, are you okay? She goes, yeah, what's going on? Well, there's a shooting at the university. She said, oh, we don't We didn't know anything about it. He said, grab your kids, leave the coffee shop, turn left. And he had her on the phone and guided her, watching her, guided her to a safe place. She later said, we were actually about to leave and walk across the university campus. That's what you're doing with the cooperative program. Yeah. I'm going to quit. I'm going to say, you're going to hear some of these things again on Sunday, but this is going to be our Central on Mission
Go
thing.
see The Great Awakening. Awesome movie.
The Great Awakening?
Yes.
Is it in the theaters?
Last night, yes.
Is-
AMC and Steve.
Is it about the Great Awakening of the 1700s? Is Jonathan Edwards in it?
Yeah.
Okay, because if he's not in it, I don't even want to see it, because you can't have a story about the Great
It's
Awakening.
mostly about George
Whitfield, okay. He was a contemporary of Edwards. Okay. All right. Y'all have a good night. Thanks for coming. Thanks for putting up with my extras. Huh?
Don't you say a closing prayer?
Sometimes, but it's late.
Here's a